Welcome back to another episode of the HIT podcast. My name is James Leighton, CEO and founder of Anderson James. This is the podcast where I bring you real-life stories from some of the most interesting leaders of our sector, and we discuss some of the biggest challenges facing UK housing today. Today, I was delighted to be joined by John Verge, Chief Executive of Golden Lane Housing. We talk about John's journey over the last 23 years with the business, some of the significant milestones and challenges he's faced. We also look at how they became fourth in the top 100 companies to work for non-for-profit, how they've become a CBS and they've demerged with Mencap, but also created a strategic partnership to deliver services to their residents. We also look at the future, Golden Lane Housing, and what John's vision is for the next 3 years. Hope you like the episode, and if you do, I'd ask that you like and subscribe. Enjoy the show. John, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, James. Hello, how are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. We've just worked out that we're in different ends of the country, and I think we're winning on the weather today, aren't we, in Manchester? So,
yeah, unusually it's wetter down here in the West Country than it is in Manchester. So I'm in Taunton in Somerset.
Nice, lovely. Well, as I always do, and where I always start is, do you mind just give us an introduction to yourself, a little bit of background about yourself and your journey?
Yeah, so John Verge. I'm Chief Exec of Golden Lane Housing, and I've been with Golden Lane Housing now for 22 years. But in terms of how I started in housing, probably quite strange in most people's careers in housing, because I actually chose to come into housing. It wasn't as often you hear, "Oh, I fell into housing," or I didn't plan to do it. It was something that I really wanted to do in my early 20s. I did an undergraduate geography degree in London. And one of the things I did in that course was actually do some community interviews with older people living in Edmonton Green in North London, and interviewed them about their communities, how they'd, at that stage, this was in the kind of mid 90s, that they lived in a community that had been consumed by Greater London. They kind of lived in a village, and then over a matter of 60, 70 years, they've been consumed into a large city. So I really enjoyed the interviews with those older people in a day centre. I did some voluntary work at Aberfield Society in Swansea, where I grew up as a child, and just got really interested. So when I finished college, did my summer work at DVLC in Swansea, I started to look for opportunities in housing. I didn't straight away get what I wanted. I actually realised that with anything, you've got to sort of, I say, start at the bottom, but you need to get the opportunities. You've got to be prepared to try different things. So I actually applied for just a role in the local authority in North Swansea for a clerical job. So I thought, if I get an opportunity to work in the local authority, and then if jobs come up, as it happens, that clerical job happened to be in the housing department. And then at the end of that interview, they said, "Oh, would you be interested to apply for the homelessness job? Because we've just found out this week that our homeless officer's leaving." So at the age of 21, I was really thrown into the deep end of housing. I spent most of my week talking to people who are homeless, whether that was individuals or families. It was at the height of the kind of mortgage issues in Britain in about 1993, and I learned so much in that. I did that role for 9 months, and really fell in love from that moment. I knew I wanted to go into housing, but I fell in love with housing and was hooked on it from day one. And then a job came up as a trainee housing officer down in Exeter with Sovereign, who at that stage had just changed their name from West Berkshire Housing Association, and had real desires to develop housing across the south and the southwest. So I joined Sovereign pretty much in its infancy, and obviously have seen it grow dramatically over the last 25 years or so. And I suppose took a fairly traditional trainee housing officer kind of role, as doing 5 days a week as a housing officer, and then doing the kind of Chartered Institute of Housing, and did a postgrad at Bristol University, and really enjoyed.
Never look back.
Really enjoyed every minute of it, and then you kind of then think, well, what do I want to do at the end of that? And I guess my passion whilst I was at Sovereign was more in the supported housing side of things, mental health, older people, and then an advert came up once one day in a publication. I don't think it exists anymore. Property Weekly, a little advert for an organisation called Golden Lane Housing that had literally just been set up by Mencap, and they were looking for a regional manager based in Taunton, but covering probably a third of the country at that stage. It was very small, had about 7 people working for it, probably 100 tenants, and didn't think at that stage when I got the job that I'd still be there 22 years later and being the chief exec. But yeah, it's the dream role for the dream organisation, and again, every day has been different. Every day's been interesting, not always positive, but always interested. And I've enjoyed every minute of the last 22 years that I've seen, that certainly have flown by.
Lovely, love that. And where did that drive and passion come from? Because I've read loads and loads when I did the research on this podcast, and it really feels like you want to help vulnerable people. I mean, that seems like it's consistent across everything I've read about you this last couple of weeks. So where's that come from, do you think?
I think it comes from the values that we've got currently now. They've changed, the words have changed, but the desire and the concepts of our values haven't changed at that time.
Yeah, fine.
It's about giving people the same opportunities as that everybody should have about a decent home. And I learned that in my early days of working in homelessness in Swansea, through to working with families in helping them into housing when I was at Sovereign, and I guess when I moved to Golden Lane Housing and actually started to learn at that stage about the real desire for people with learning disabilities to have independence, but not having those opportunities. They just weren't there when I joined in 2000. Grant funding had basically been decimated for supported housing. There was none. The accommodation that was being offered to people with learning disabilities was either in very large registered care homes or large institutions. And I probably spent, in fact we still do, but I certainly spent probably the first decade with Golden Lane Housing getting a lot of people out of institutional settings, and to see the change in their lives was really important and fantastic to see. I think the other thing I really liked about when I joined Golden Lane Housing was about the individual, the people, their families. It wasn't the bricks and mortar. Yes, you had to have knowledge and skills to provide the housing, the bricks and mortar themselves, but we actually got to know the individuals. We still do. We provide housing where we know the people that are going to move into those accommodation. Sometimes it's more strategic planning and planned, and we may develop a particular project that we don't know everybody who's moving in. But more often than not, we actually have spoken to them. We've designed the new accommodation around their requirements, and that was a real a breath of fresh air for me as well when I came into the work in the supported housing sector.
Yeah, and what's changed fundamentally for you over that 23 years? Not just in Golden, not just in the Golden Lane journey, but in the general housing and supported housing. What's changed? What's been the fundamental changes, would you say, over the last 23 years?
I think there's some really positive changes, and embrace, government and local authorities have embraced that choice and control that people should have. Yeah. That's still reliant on funding, revenue, capital. I have to say that there were, in some cases we've gone backwards in some ways. People, I mean, this is austerity and government policies meant that the funding is often there for people with more complex needs, but people with perhaps more mild or moderate learning disabilities, cuts in supporting people and lack of grant funding has meant that those choices aren't always there, that perhaps they were there 15 years ago. The challenges continue, but what I've seen is a real desire across the sector, whether that's National Housing Federation, working with local authorities and health authorities and government departments, that they recognise that there are changes that need to continue to be made. So that is fantastic. I think the other thing for me is people with learning disabilities and people with autism continue to want to have that independence, and they should absolutely have the right to choose that if that's what they want. So they're more and more they'll be given a voice, and I welcome what the regulator's doing around consumer standards and tenant satisfaction measures, and we've been doing a lot of work ourselves around raising the voice of our tenants. Interestingly, they didn't want to be engaged with Gold Lane Housing; they want to be involved and and lead our work rather than just be talked to. And that's very much our mantra from day one in terms of involving them in the design of their home, not just being told, well, "Here are the keys. Do you want to accept it or not?"
Yeah. No, that's really nice. And I want to come back to that because I wanted you to just give us a bit of a helicopter view of Golden Lane as it sits there today. So what's the sort of helicopter view of the business today?
Yeah, so I mentioned when I joined, I had 100 tenants. But from day one, Mencap, who set us up as a separate charity, wanted to provide accommodation that wasn't being provided by providers at that time. A lot of bespoke accommodation, but also accommodation across the whole country, working with support providers. So we work with Mencap, and we'll obviously work with Mencap from day one, who provide care and support. But Mencap also wanted to give people choice about who provided support and care in their home. So from day one, we were working with national, regional, local providers. And over the last 25 years, because it'll be nearly 25 years, we're celebrating 25 years next year, we've grown to nearly 2,500 people that we now house across England, Wales, and over the last 5 years, we've also worked in Northern Ireland, providing all manner of different types of accommodation. People who live on their own, in a flat, house or bungalow, people who want to share with other people, and also providing self-contained accommodation, whether that's bungalows or flats, sometimes on their own, sometimes in small clusters, but basically it's accommodation in people's communities, at the heart of their communities. I would say most of our accommodation tend to be in urban areas. We have got some rural accommodation, but most of our tenants want access to, the cinema, the pub, the doctor surgeries, to their families. So we tend to house people in most urban locations, and we're across the whole of the country. It brings its own dynamics. We try to think about how we each year grow and try and work sensibly, but we're there for to work to provide accommodation across the whole of the country, and I'm really proud that we've got houses from Penzance across to Dover, up to Hexham, and across to Cumbria, and then parts of North Wales, and now, and as I said, over in Northern Ireland now.
And how does that work? I mean, so how do you acquire stock all over the country like you have done? Because that is such a dispersed amount of stock in loads and loads of different locations. But how does that happen?
It happens. Well, first it happens because we've got some brilliant people that work for us and who have worked for us over the last 25 years. Really passionate people. People are, get out there, have the sofa conversations with people with learning disabilities and their families. We've always done a mixture of purchase and build, but also lease. It's around providing different options and different solutions. We were very blessed to have some seed funding from Mencap, who invested in Golden Lane to start with, to enable us then to go out and borrow some traditional bank and building society lending that enables us to go and buy properties. We've always worked with grant funding, predominantly health and local authority. Perhaps I'll come on later on in terms of some of the challenges. We haven't been able to access any of the what was Housing Corporation or Homes England funding yet, and I do say yet because we've got real desires to do that. But it's been a mixture of our own private finance, some grant funding, and some lease arrangements. And that private funding, we've really tried to do creative stuff around that. So as well as the kind of traditional bank and building society borrowing, we've also done bonds, retail charity bonds, some social investment bonds, to bring the money in that we desperately need to provide the housing that's so desperately needed by people with learning disabilities and people with autism.
And on a broader subject, is there enough housing out there? Is there enough provision of housing out there for people with learning disabilities? Or are we still miles away from that perspective?
I think it's important. The type of housing for people with learning disabilities is interesting, because if you think about it's probably just worth saying where people currently live who've got a learning disability, because there's probably around about 900,000 adults with a learning disability. Predominantly, they either live with family carers, mum and dad, often older mums and dads, or with siblings, or they will live in registered care homes. That's predominantly where, even now, where most people live. But what we've obviously seen over the last 20, 25 years is a movement more into supported housing, more into living in social housing, and a very small percentage living in the private rented sector. So that's where people live. Where people want to live is different to that. And obviously our role is to, either directly or indirectly with support and advice to support people into that accommodation. So 7 out of 10 people with learning disability want to live independently. Mm-hmm. Clearly 7 out of 10 people with learning disability don't currently live independently. So the demand is out there. In terms of the supply, well, lots of people with learning disability would absolutely be able to live in the private rented sector or in ordinary social housing without necessarily being designated as support. But I guess from our perspective and our experiences is that the system isn't designed, and the welfare system isn't always designed for that. So if you've got a learning disability, living with mum and dad, and you would like to live in social housing, just the way waiting lists and common waiting list point system works, it just doesn't work. Very few people with learning disabilities, mum and dad will threaten them with serving notice on them, so people get stuck at home. Frankly, they get stuck at home. Private rented sector, even if you can get over the issues of local housing allowance levels and get the deposit, you do see whether it's direct or indirect discrimination in the private rented sector. Some of that's indirect because just the very nature of the private sector, particularly at the moment, you need to make a decision quick. And obviously, if someone with a learning disability needs a package of the appropriate care and support, a circle of support to support them into that accommodation, they're not always going to be able to make a quick decision or be able to meet the requirements and expectations of a letting agent. And sadly, sometimes you see direct discrimination where we've been told, or people with learning disabilities have been told, we can't let to you directly. So we've been doing a lot of work over the last 15 years to support people into that private rented sector by taking on leases directly ourselves. Because obviously, I don't know what the exact percentage is now, but you're close to 20% of tenure across England and Wales and probably in Scotland and Northern Ireland is in the private rented sector, but only 3% of people with a learning disability, when Mencap did a research about 10 years ago, were living in the private rented sector. So there's lots of accommodation out there that people with learning disabilities should be able to access that they've not been able to access. And then in terms of the provision for supported housing, that's where organisations like Golden Lane, larger housing associations have been there to provide the more specialist supported housing for people.
And for my benefit more than anything really, but what comes first? If I've got a learning disability and I want to find housing and want to live in the place I want to live, do I go for the care package first and the support that I need first, or do I go for the housing? How does the process of that work without getting into the technicality?
There's an element of, in a sense, both.
Okay.
I would say, in terms of support, yes, you absolutely need to have a support package to be able to move successfully into your own home, whether that's designated and described as supported housing or it's a property that you own. There's lots of people with learning disability who own their own home, maybe left to them by their mum and dad. That's not always the best way. We'd always advise to put it into a trust and manage it that way. But you need the right support package in place. Having said that, often you won't get the opportunity to negotiate with your local authority or your health authority that support package if you don't have an opportunity or have identified somewhere to potentially move to.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So there is an element of you need to think about both at the same time. But from our perspective, whilst we can talk about options with prospective people who approach us, we always say to them, ultimately, we're not going to start looking for a home. We can give an idea of what could be possible, but we're not going to start looking or buying a property or building something unless, we've had those conversations with the local authority or the health authority to pay for that funding.
Yeah, fine. Okay, that makes sense. And do you get a lot of collaboration with other housing associations? Because I presume what you do is very specialist and very niche.
It is very specialist. I mean, in terms of our key partners, obviously, apart from local authorities and health authorities who fund the support, we work very closely with support and care providers. So we don't directly provide the care and support. We provide specialist housing services and bespoke housing services. But we think it's very important that the housing and support is separate, so that person can choose who their support provider is, who their care provider is, without having to move home, because it's their home. So we work with over 150 different care and support providers across the country. We also work very closely with other social landlords. Sometimes that may be because we lease from them, or they may go into sort of some kind of partnership arrangement with them. But in other ways, it's just because as a collective, we believe that we're stronger together, whether it's dealing with issues that we had to contend with 5 years ago around the local housing allowance cap, or feeding into government policy. And that's really important for us, that we work very closely with our peers.
Yeah, and you talk about this bespoke nature, and everyone is entitled to the home they want, which I really like. And when I read the website, how much bespoke and how much adaptation can you do to a house? Because I mean, clearly everyone's unique and everybody needs different things and different needs. So it must be a real difficult process, because every individual will need something slightly different. Is that right, or is it tailored?
Yeah, no, they will. And we'll look at the individual or group if it's 2 or 3 people who want to share with each other. And for people that we house with a learning disability or autism, as well as their learning disability or autism, they may also have other requirements around physical disabilities, and other things that will impact on the design and the adaptations required on the property. So some of the work that we do on property, you wouldn't necessarily see when you walked into the property, and in many ways we wouldn't want you to see, because we'd want it to feel not like an institution, but feel like an ordinary house. So some of the whether it's making sure that the property is robust, because some of our tenants, we don't want them to change their behaviour. We want them to live in their home as they want to. But some of our properties will get higher wear and tear. Some people will require additional space, both internally and maybe externally, so that they've got privacy. Some of our tenants will make noise, and we don't want to be dealing with a neighbour complaining about noise when frankly we can't do anything about it, because our tenants will make noise occasionally. So it may be that we need a property that's got some space around it, maybe detached, or in some cases actually some background noise. I've learned from experience that not always the quieter parts of a village or a town are the best places to move people who are going to make noise and want to make noise. Actually, having a bit of background noise often helps them, in that sense as well. So we really look at the individual. Yeah, that costs money, and obviously we work with, where we can with grant funding, but often if we're funding a scheme in its entirety ourselves, we could often be put in, almost 100% capital into that project. So, on top of the purchase price, we may be spending another 20-25% on that property. And that's when we set up a scheme. We want it not just to be, long term for that individual, if they want to remain and live there for a long time, but if they don't want to live there any longer, their needs change or their health change, we really need to be working with the local authority and the health authority and support providers to set something up that's got longevity, because obviously we need to make sure that, ultimately we need every scheme to financially work, both from a revenue and a capital side. So that's why we work very closely with commissioners to make sure that every scheme we set up has got their full support, they're on board with it. Occasionally that means sharing, risks on voids and getting their commitment on nomination agreements. So it's a real partnership arrangement between the tenant, the families, the support provider, the local authority, and obviously housing benefit, because we will always need to make sure that the rent that will be charged, and often that will be significantly higher than the local housing allowance levels, is going to be a sustainable figure. And we can be transparent about those costs, but we don't hide or apologize for those costs, because people that we're housing, well, most of our tenants have 24-hour support, sometimes more than one, 2-to-1 support, sometimes sharing the support if they're sharing with other people. But we've shown through our social impact reports, we do an annual social impact report, that the financial benefit to society and to government, both central and local, is substantial, whether that's people moving from institutional or hospital settings, or moving from registered care homes. It ranges from hundreds, if not thousands of pounds a week, overall savings to the public purse, and most importantly, supports and ensures people have got the best lives that they can live in their communities. And working with families particularly who are constantly worried about what's going to happen when they're no longer there. If we can move people before they are unable to care for them, or they're no longer around, that's the best thing for me, to see families visit their loved ones in their home, to give that assurance that they've got the quality of the housing and the quality of the support is just the best thing.
Yeah, and final thing on this, because I could talk about this forever, but what have you seen in your 23 years at Golden Lane that's been, I don't know, an evolution, or what things have come in that have made it easier to adapt homes? Has there been anything like in terms of innovation within that sector that's really, really made it easier to house people? Has been anything key in that, would you say?
Innovation that's made it easier, I would say, we're really focused on fire safety at the moment. Okay. And the fact that now we can put in fire doors that meet all the requirements, but they look like normal doors. That sounds quite a small thing, but actually it's really important, because we need to make sure as a sector that acknowledging that it isn't just about high-rise buildings. It is about the vulnerabilities of some of our residents, that we need to make sure that the appropriate fire safety is there. So just things that enable us to design and adapt a property that when you walk in feels like anybody else's property, and that you and I would want to live in, and obviously our tenants want to live in. So a kitchen that looks like a normal kitchen, but actually can be does meet the needs of someone with physical disabilities. Those kind of things are really important. What we're really excited about, I guess, going forward, is how do we as a sector better use technology, digital technology, far better, particularly around communications with our tenants, because what they're telling us is it's all very well to get the house right, but how do we work with them when they're living in the home to really be engaged with us as a landlord? And technology, I think, is really important about with that.
No, it's an amazing story. I mean, and for me, there's so much more to come. Like you say, technology will hopefully help some of these elements. But I really wanted to get you on because the last couple of years there's been a lot happen. So if we bring it to the present day, I read about the 4th in the top 100 times companies to work for, non-for-profit, 2nd in the top 25 housing associations. Talk me through that? Why? I mean, they're big numbers and they're really, really inspirational.
Yeah, I think the important thing to say is we've been doing the best companies now for 4 or 5 years, and we it's nice to get the recognition, and it's fantastic to see that. But we do it for the reason that we learn from those surveys, what it tells us, what the improvements that we want to make, whether it's about well-being or making sure that we're as exec team or as managers, engaged with our teams who work across the country. We've got a team in Manchester, but majority of our staff work all around the country, and we've in a sense had hybrid working, years before the current changes from the pandemic. But how we've got there, I think we've created a very people-focused, value-led organisation that's, I said, led not just led from the top, it's led from the foundations. Everybody who comes to join Golden Lane Housing joins us with, in knowing the values that we expect and want from our team members. It doesn't just happen. You've got to work at it. You need honest conversations and look to improve all the time. But being part of a sector that can really show the difference on a day-to-day basis, I think we've got a benefit from that. I have to say, we do. We actually have a benefit of working something where you can really see the difference, and not just for the people directly dealing with our tenants. I make sure that whether it's people working in the finance team or working behind the scenes, that they know that the difference that they make on a day-to-day basis to the lives. I think that really helps. We talk about the Golden Lane Housing family. Both staff, both working with our tenant representatives. We've done a huge amount of work engaging with our tenants over recent years. We've got a really good engaged board of voluntary non-execs, many of whom have got a direct connection with learning disabilities and autism. So there's a real passion there, but we don't take it lightly, and it hasn't just happened. It's a huge amount of hard work and dedication from across the organisation.
Yeah, and to be honest, when you look at the list of the 100 non-for-profit, you'd argue that the services that Golden Lane provide and some of the, I imagine, difficult, you put a very positive spin on it, but I bet there's some really difficult circumstances within the organisation as well, because you're dealing with vulnerable people. It's incredible to be 4th. I mean, it is incredible. I know you're probably being quite humble there, but it really is an achievement for your people to be that happy and that inspired and that bought into the culture of Golden Lane that you've come 4th in the top 100, definitely.
Yeah, thank you, James. I mean, it's something that we just want to get better.
Yeah, absolutely. And I read as well, September 21. I don't understand this ins and outs of this, so you're probably going to have to explain this. But you did a CBS or becoming a CBS in September 2021. Tell us a little bit about that. What is it? What does it mean? And all of that.
Well, I suppose part of our journey as an organisation. Community Benefit Society, for those that don't know what CBS is. And frankly, probably a couple of years ago, I wasn't too aware of the term. I was probably more aware of industrial provident, which was the previous term that was often used, because I know Sovereign were, or certainly when I was there, it was an industrial provident. It tends to be, most housing associations have that structure. Up until last September, we were a registered charity, as well as being a registered housing association with the regulator of social housing. But our journey over the last few years has been one that we made a decision with MenCap that it was time for us to become a standalone housing association rather than part of the MenCap group. We've always had a kind of independence from MenCap while still working obviously very closely with them. From the day we were set up, we've had a separate board of what was trustees, now non-exec directors. And we had our own culture, the fact that we've been over the last 5 years submitting our own best company survey and having the recognition as Golden Lane Housing. But I think we reached the size of maturity whereby I reported as the chief exec to the board of Golden Lane Housing. We became a registered provider in 2015.
Yeah.
Different reasons for that, but partly and mainly to do with the fact that we'd reached the size where we felt we needed the scrutiny of a regulator to improve us as an organisation. And I certainly think that we've found that scrutiny really valuable over the last 5-6 years. And that's 2 years ago we'd got to kind of over 2,000 tenants, and being part of a group structure gave, I guess, responsibility to MenCap, which I felt we were mature enough and big enough to go to our next stage of our growth and delivering services and housing solutions to people with learning disabilities. So it was a joint decision by both boards. Decision came very easy. We've obviously been working hard in terms of the demerger over the last year because we're taking some of the services that we've been getting from MenCap in-house. We've got a new finance system that we've got coming up on the 1st of April when we demerge from MenCap. But the important thing for me was the new partnership arrangement that we'll have with MenCap going forward, because they're still going to be an absolute critical key partner, working with them on services, both existing and new. Obviously the campaigning and influencing work, just really excited to continue to work with them. I mean, obviously I've been working closely with MenCap for 2 decades now, and I see on a daily basis the fantastic work that they do, both in their own services but also that campaigning and influence work they do. So very proud to be aligned with them both now and going forward.
Yeah, because I was going to say, normally when you hear demerger, you think, oh, something's gone wrong here. But clearly it was very much positioned in the media and on the websites as an exciting new beginning for both in terms of a strategic partnership, but also some independence for Golden Lane to go off and do what you want to go and do. And that's important.
Yeah, and absolutely recognise that, going forward, and we looked at different structures. We didn't just automatically go for the community benefit society, but looking at the structures, the expectations around from the regulator clearly is that and also the NatFed's code of governance is that you look at your structures and you look at your mergers and acquisitions and positioning ourselves in as a community benefit site. We think we'll position ourselves very well to look at the opportunities to future partnerships, and I think we're always been keen on the outcomes, the mission of Golden Lane Housing. We want to be at the forefront of that going forward.
Yeah. And talking about that at the forefront, you as an individual seem at the forefront of influencing the UK supported housing market. You've got a chair role with the Learning Disability and Autism Housing Network, and you're doing all sorts. I mean, tell us about that, because you're obviously going one step further with all this. I mean, you're already in your professional life leading and driving Golden Lane Housing, but also outside of that, you're trying to drive everyone else in that direction too.
Yeah. I mean, you could. Yeah, there is a, I guess, a selfish part of that we've recognised probably about 3 years ago on the back of the I guess the work we had to do fighting the local housing allowance cap proposal from government and working very closely with MenCap and National Housing Federation and lots of housing associations and support providers. But we learned from that actually we're far better if we work together. Yeah, there's competitive market, but there's a huge need and demand out there. Far better we work together. So there's an element of actually it's in Golden Lane's housing interest to work very closely with the peers. From a personal basis, I've always wanted to have the greatest impact personally that I can have. And there's only so much Golden Lane, and there's only so much any organisation can do. So I feel quite honoured, and that I can, even in a very small way, influence government policy or local policy. So that's a real a desire for me. And I guess you don't come into housing unless you like working with people. I mean,
of course.
Of course. I think one of the reasons I came into housing in the first place because was those interviews that I had with those older people in Edmonton Green. It was I didn't come into housing because I wanted to become a developer. Although I've done development work and I've built my skills and knowledge in that area, but because I really like people and the opportunity to talk to, whether it's peers about issues, come up with solutions, talk to government officials, talk to politicians about, some of the barriers, but some of the successes, really, again, fight for people with learning disabilities and housing, because sometimes even within supported housing, we can, our voice can be overpowered by, older people housing or homelessness, and all really important areas. But, my passion clearly is around learning disability. So anything we can do to make sure we bring that alive and explain the issues is important. And let's be frank, there's been lots of scrutiny and criticism of parts of the sector over the last 3 or so years. And that's why it's really important that we also advocate for the good parts that the sector's doing, the good things the sector's doing, the good practice that the sector's doing. And if we can influence others to follow our lead, then that would be fantastic.
Yeah. And who is involved in the network at the moment? Like, is it businesses or is it individuals, or what's its design?
All housing associations. So housing associations of various sizes and of various different types. But the main thing is that they have a passion and desire to provide services and house people with learning disabilities and support with it, influence in that change. So that varies from the very large housing association like Place for People and Home Group and Riverside to some large regional providers like Live West down in the southwest where I live, to Onward Homes in the northwest, and then we've got some more specialists like Golden Lane. So you've got organisations like Advance and Care Housing Association, and then you've got some housing associations that, as well as doing some more general needs, also have a significant amount of learning disability services. So Progress Housing Group, who work across the country but have got a presence in Lancashire. They are one of our founding members as well.
Wow! And what's the plan for that group to grow and to get better and to help, or where does it end?
Where does it end? Well, we've got a real desire as a group to share good practice and have some frank and honest and confidential conversations at meetings. We meet 4 times a year to have some really good conversations and share good practice. But yeah, we always set up around an influencing campaigning role. One of the first things we set up 3 years ago now, and I sat down with Kate Henderson at the NatFed, and we talked about setting up the group, and the NatFed have been really supportive on it. Right. But we felt it was really important that we had a kind of independent voice for people with learning disabilities, so that we could advocate and share our views in certain areas. So we certainly want to do a lot of that. We want to make some changes as well. There are things that aren't working in the system. The grant system isn't working for people with learning disabilities. For those that work in work in housing who know the rent standard. Again, we don't think that works for our type of accommodation. And yeah, we want to advocate for more funding, support funding, because without that, it's not gonna work for people to provide the housing that's needed. I guess the other thing that we recognise that yes, we may have won the fight with the local housing allowance, but welfare reform and housing benefit hasn't gone away, and we need to make sure that there's a robust, long-term, sustainable welfare benefit system for people, not just with learning disabilities, but across the whole of the supported housing sector. So you know, I engage, the group engages with you know, some fantastic, you know, officials in different government departments, whether that's the Department of Levelling Up, whether that's Department of Health and Social Care, who, you know, really, I think, get, you know, the impact and the challenges that we have. So we'll continue to do that, James, going forward.
And just on that, because you just give me a little point there, how many of people with learning disabilities don't understand or aren't educated enough to understand that there's another path for them? i.e., is there a lot of your role in shining a light on the sector that we've got within supported housing to say to people there is another place you could live? Because you said obviously most people live at home or in institutional. Do people know that this is an option?
Yeah, no, information across all different groups, but particularly in this is not there as it should be. And I think the social care white paper recognises that there needs to be more information. Needs to be more information accessible, and that, yes, that can come from local authorities, but there are a lot of groups and organisations there who provide that. Learning Disability England, MENCAT websites that provide that. And yes, certainly our job at Golden Lane Housing and certainly the housing network is to try and get that information out there to share that. So, and it needs to be in an accessible way. It to be a balance between, you know, you want to tell people the options, but you don't want to kind of raise expectations too much, because you know, frankly, you know, at the moment the supply wouldn't meet the demand out there. But unless we have people knowing what the options are, advocating for people, but also, you know, talking to their local MP, saying, or their local saying, well, why is not learning disability housing, you know, a priority in your area? And the good thing about the social care white paper is it puts housing at the forefront of social and health care, and they're going to be prime, you know, funding some money for local authorities to develop their strategic plans and to deliver more options, which is a great thing to see.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we just look to the future, a couple more things, and we'll wrap up. But what do you think can be done if you had to name a couple of things that you'd like to see to improve the provision of housing for those with learning difficulties? What would you love to see?
For people with more mild and moderate learning disabilities, the biggest issue, and in a sense for me a disgrace of government policy and over the last 10 years has been almost the decimation of supporting people funding, which was a fantastic opportunity for people to get money, often maybe a few hours a week, support, floating support. Sometimes that supporting people money came in to people's supported housing schemes. That was just decimated when they stopped the ring fence pot of that, and local authorities then used that money elsewhere. That was probably the biggest impact, particularly with people with mild to moderate learning disabilities. And what you've seen as an impact of that and an effect of that is you've seen lots of providers try to fill the gap, often with subsidising the support. You know, some of the larger housing associations, I'm sure, are cross-subsidising it, and in some cases, what you've seen is people trying to work around housing benefit and calling different housing management intensive housing management, which would have been previously supporting people funding. So I think that's for people with low support needs. For people with high support needs, more complex needs, the people that we would be housing, we need a grant funding system that works for that type of accommodation. We've done some research. We've shared this with the regulator of social housing and with Homes England. We've done some research. So for people that we're being asked to house, you'd need around between 70 and 80% of grant levels to meet the rent standard and affordable rents. And I'm not aware of any of our members, other than those that have cross-subsidised it from other funds, that have been able to get that level of funding. So hence why you end up with 100%, privately funded schemes. So we were really pleased to see the 10% affordable homes programme being designated for the first time for supported housing. Our challenge to Homes England, we're going to be we want to work really close with them. I mentioned it earlier on that, we're really hoping that we can do some schemes with Homes England over the next 2 or 3 years, both ourselves and other members. So our challenge to government and Homes England is to make that happen.
Yeah, fine. And you might have answered this, but I always ask every guest, if you could change one thing in UK government around the housing sector, what would that one thing be? Would it be funding in what you've just said, or
I would say it would be a long-term certainty on revenue funding, both for housing benefit and for support. There are two reasons for that. Firstly, you saw some really good housing associations step away from providing supported housing, and particularly supported housing for people with disabilities over the last 5 years, on the back of uncertainty about housing benefit. It's very complex. It's not straightforward to do. And if you've got a medium-sized or a large-sized housing association, their board's looking at their priorities, there's enough demand and work for them to do in general needs and other supported housing for them to focus on, and so they've stepped away from that. I think for support funding, it's not just the amount of support funding, it's the level, and paying support and care staff more than they're being paid now. We've seen an exodus in the last 6 months, following on from people returning to employment in whether it's restaurants and hotels and supermarkets, because they get paid more than they would do as a care or support worker. So that for me, the two things that, in a sense, they're fundamental to enable organisations like Golden Lane and support providers like MENCAP and local authorities across the country to do what they need to do.
So true. And we did some work with Riverside last year. I've done work with Home Group in the past, and salaries need to change. And I don't know how we do that, but clearly there needs to be more funding available to allow those salaries to increase, because the work that those people do on the front line is absolutely unbelievable, and especially during COVID,
Well, yeah, everybody was happy to go and stand at 8 o'clock on their doorstep on a Thursday night and clap for carers, and realised that they were absolutely crucial. But the professionalism and it's just not recognised. Carers and support providers, the work that they do, and whether it's supporting people with their life skills, whether it's giving medication, it's just not recognised, and something needs to change.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree. And as we wrap up, final question, and I suppose a nice way for us always to end is just, what do you see with MENCAP and the demerger and everything that you've now done in the last 2 or 3 years? What does the future of Golden Lane housing look like, and where do you see the next 5 years shaping?
Next 5 years, well, we're just about to launch our next three-year plan.
Okay.
We used to have a 5-year corporate plan. We decided that firstly 5 years was too long. We needed a 3-year plan, and we got rid of corporate because our tenants, probably frankly our staff, didn't understand what corporate meant. So we've got our plan now, which we've developed with staff, the board, and for the first time our tenants, and they're involved with now designing far more accessible version than we've ever had before. So the next 3 years we're setting out. I think tenant engagement, involvement is going to be at the heart of that, to support us improve and be the organisation that we want to be. We obviously will have a real desire to house as many people as we possibly can with both our own funding and lease arrangements, and getting the right balance on the leases. We've never entered into long-term leases other than with local authorities where we've got appropriate kind of break clauses. But whilst we've looked on at the sector that's been criticised by the regulator around that model, and we haven't done that, there is a balance around providing as much security as we possibly can to tenants in lease property. So we're going to be working on that to get the right balance and give those life opportunities that just haven't been there. And I guess what sticks in my mind is a gentleman that we housed from a hospital in Cornwall about 15 years ago now, a hospital that was on the news because of terrible abuse. I visited the hospital at the time, and it was a prison cell. People lived in prison cells. It wasn't a hospital that you and I would even imagine it to be. And he was actually very seriously ill before we moved him into his bungalow that we adapted. And he only lived there 6 months before, sadly, he passed away. But if we'd have done what the doctors and the medical staff at the time had told us to do, which was basically keep the hospital open because he couldn't live, he wouldn't have learned how to surf. He wouldn't have had his own, not just his own bedroom, but his own kitchen, his own garden, his own, and speaking to his mum and dad after he passed away and having those 6 months, I think really showed to me, whether it's 6 months or 25 years, we do make a difference. And we're very poor at telling people what we do. And we need to, now we're out of COVID, get the politicians, get the government officials out there to see the real difference, rather than just hear the negative aspects, whether it's the exempt accommodations in Birmingham at the moment or concerns about certain models of the housing sector. The vast majority of providers in the sector are just life-changing organisations, and I'm just very blessed and proud to work in this part of the sector, and there's some fantastic people that we work with.
Honestly, what a lovely way to finish, but the story is just inspirational to me. It's a part of the sector, honestly, I didn't know loads and loads about. I know supported housing, but your part of the sector really, really resonates with me, as I said offline, and I think I'm really looking forward to tracking the journey now over the next 5 years, and I wish you all the best, and I'm sure the listeners are going to get great value out of that episode.
Oh, well, thanks, James. No, it's been great just to share a bit about what we do, and it's been great. Thanks, James.
Well, I'll catch up with you soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks.